I spend an awful lot of time on rivers. I lost my wife 8 years ago. I have an enormous gap to fill, and I fill it with my love of rivers, the wildlife that surrounds them. If you sit still for, it takes about 20 minutes, then you actually blend in. It's as though you're part of it. As a teenager, fishing, fly fishing, I got extremely interested in the fly life. I found the flies were easier to catch than the trout. So I spent probably the rest of my life up to now studying all of the invertebrates in the river. Some of my most memorable experiences on the river are some of the mass emergence, standing out in the river, the females completely surrounded me, laying their eggs. And as I walked upstream, the whole cloud would follow me upstream because of the disturbance in the water. They lay their eggs where the water is broken. The whole swarm were following me upriver. That's quite an experience. And sadly, it's an experience with this mass emergence that is getting less and less. We're trying to get those enormous hatches back, you know, that a lot of people don't notice. And if they don't notice when they're there, they certainly won't notice when they're gone. If you want to know something about the conditions of anywhere, you ask the things that live there. And every single invertebrate tells you, I like this, but I don't like that. I'm sensitive to this. If you analyse them, you'll be able to tell what the water quality is. The study that I'm involved with is now being done right across the country through various organisations to try to look after our rivers that are under increasing threats all the time. Invertebrates are at the bottom of the food chain. Whatever affects them is going to affect everything afterwards. For instance, we had a bad pollution on one river, knocked out most of the invertebrates for about 10 to 15 miles downriver. Didn't affect the fish at all, except they didn't have anything to eat, so they were gone. They'd moved off downstream where there was more food. So they are important because without them, nothing else can exist. I'm working on the River Avon on the London Anglers Association's water below Salisbury. One of the big problems we've got is with one of our caddisflies, the granum. It's an early emerging caddisfly. Normally the adults emerge around the middle of April. The larvae attach themselves to weed to feed upriver. And if the weed is cut too early, the weed flows downriver through the city where there's about 4 or 5 bridges. Normally, migration of the adults would counteract that to a certain extent, but they don't like going under bridges. They see that as a barrier and they congregate below the lowest bridge and they get caught in the city. The project will help the next generation of caddis to recolonise the river upstream. What we're doing now is collecting the eggs from the egg-laying females on these boards. They crawl down on the post and lay their eggs underneath. And you can see this mass of eggs here. There's absolutely millions of eggs that are forming along the board. When these are fully formed in probably about a week, then we shall move these upstream. So we'll recolonise the river above the bridges. We're giving them a helping hand to get over that obstacle. I'm 80 next year. Getting in and out of rivers is getting a little bit more difficult, but I will carry on doing this as long as I can, because it's people power that is going to protect our rivers.
What a lovely, lovely man. Do you know what I love about that? You know, we saw Cal earlier, who's a young woman. We saw Cyril, who's an older gentleman. So the different generations, all passionate about wildlife and doing their thing. And as Cyril said, it's all about people power. We all need to get involved if we're going to reverse the devastation that's happened to wildlife.
Top bloke, and we love an expert on this programme. But we also love what they love too. And caddisfly larvae, I've loved them all of my life. They're such fascinating little things. Now, they cover themselves in detritus on the bottom of the river. These are whole living aquatic larvae, but they have to move from hole to hole. So in order to camouflage themselves, they dress up in whatever the substrate is on that part of the riverbed. So you saw one there covered in stones. These, look, are covering themselves in vegetable detritus. They nibble that as well, that's what they feed on. And they use a silk, rather like a spider or a caterpillar silk, that comes from organs just beneath their mouth, to glue all of this together into a little tube. It's open both ends so the water can pass through and they can breathe. They're big enough to turn around in it, and because they're constantly growing, they add to the front of the tube and then they turn around and nibble off the tail so that they can continue to grow. Look at that last one there. Look at that, covered in those wonderful little snails underneath the water that it's put together there. And here's one last fascinating thing. I was reading today about a group of paleontologists who were looking at fossil beds in Brazil in 2016, and they found evidence of caddisfly larval cases like that from the early Permian period. How old do you reckon the early Permian is?
A couple of hundred years, million years ago.
295 million years. Caddisfly larvae have been making those little, camouflage tubes for 295 million years. I like that a lot.
I don't think I can quite compete with that, because I'm now going to look at the adult when they metamorphose. It's nowhere near as colourful as the larva itself, but this is the adult. It's actually quite closely related to moths, except it has hairy wings, whereas the moths had scales on its wings. And unlike things like mayfly, which die after about a day, these can live for up to a month. They have ancient mouth parts that actually helps them to feed on nectar. But I quite like them. I've walked rivers, and you put them up, sometimes in their dozen. And if you're very, very lucky, at certain times of the year, it's only on certain years as well, you may well witness a mass emergence. As our wildlife cameraman Mark Yates saw a couple of days ago, the weather has to be still, it has to be warm, and then millions, and I mean millions, of caddisflies all emerge at once. And this is tactical, because they want to flood that market, because there are lots of predators out there, like grey wagtails, that'll eat them, but they're ensuring that at least some of them will make it through to mate and lay their eggs. Common sandpipers too will come and eat them along the edge of the water there, and it is a glut. And I've only ever witnessed this once, and it is one of the most remarkable things I have ever seen. Just look at that. The air is alive with them, absolutely alive with them. Dippers, of course, they eat the larvae, but they eat the adults as well. He is an adult dipper there. And where the dipper has an advantage, of course, is that they can go under the water and they can grab the adults just as they emerge. And we think that the species here is the granum, which is the very one that Cyril Bennett was looking at earlier on. Have you ever seen anything quite like that?
That is a spring spectacle, isn't it?
It is.
As Cyril was saying, you're lucky to see them these days because they don't happen so much, but truly remarkable.